November 9th, 1994. Atascocita, Texas. Fratta was 33 years old, a mother of 3. 8 days away from the freedom she had fought for, she never saw it. Miles away, her husband sat in a church pew surrounded by their children, calm, still, unbothered. He already knew what was happening in that garage, because he planned every single detail of it. Cut to a badge, a police uniform hanging on a wall, a firefighter's helmet. The man who ordered her death? He was the same man sworn to protect lives, and he had been planning this openly for years. But here's what nobody knew yet. The one mistake that would unravel everything didn't even happen at the crime scene. Welcome to True Crime Corner, where no case ever stays cold. In today's case, we are diving deep into the story of Robert Allen Fratta, a police officer, a firefighter, a father, and a calculated murderer who thought he had built the perfect crime. Before we get into it, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. We love seeing you all out there. Now, let's get into it. There are people in this world who wear their evil openly. You can see it in their eyes, feel it in the way they move through a room. Those people are dangerous, but they are also easy to spot. And then there are people like Robert Allen Fratta. People who hide behind uniforms, behind titles, behind the trust of an entire community that never once thought to look closer. It's people who understand that the best place to conceal a monster is inside the very institution built to protect everyone else from one. This is that kind of story. Robert Allen Fratta was born on February 22, 1957, in Westbury, New York. By all early accounts, there was nothing remarkable about his childhood, nothing that would have made a neighbor stop and say, years later, that they always knew something was wrong. He was just a boy growing up in a quiet corner of New York, in a world that had no idea what he would one day become. At some point, Fratta made his way south, to the sprawling suburbs of Houston, Texas, eventually settling in Missouri City, a quiet, clean, middle-class community southwest of the city. And it was there that Robert Fratta built the life he wanted the world to see. He became a public safety officer for the Missouri City Department of Public Safety, not just a police officer, not just a firefighter. Both, simultaneously. Robert Fratta wore 2 uniforms, carried 2 sets of responsibilities, and earned the trust of an entire community twice over. He was the man people called when their house was burning. He was the man people called when they feared for their safety. He was, by every outward measure, a protector, and he was very, very good at making people believe that. In 1983, Robert Fratta married a woman named Farah Fahmida Bakwer. Farah was everything the word home is supposed to mean. She was intelligent, warm, deeply connected to her family, and by every account of the people who loved her, genuinely good. The kind of person who made a room feel safer just by being in it, together. Robert and Farah built a life in Missouri City. They had 3 children, a house in the suburbs, a family portrait that looked exactly the way a family portrait is supposed to look. From the outside, they were the kind of couple that other people pointed to. The officer, the devoted mother, the children, the home, everything in its right place. But a portrait is just a surface, and surfaces can hide a great deal. Behind the closed doors of that Missouri City home, The reality of life with Robert Fratta was something very different from what the neighbors saw. Those closest to the family would later describe Fratta as controlling, a man who needed to dominate every space he occupied, every relationship he was part of. He was manipulative, he was abusive, and he was the kind of man who believed deeply and without question, and that the people around him existed to serve his needs. Farah endured it. For years, she endured it, because that is what so many women in her position do. They hold on, they hope, they protect their children, and they wait for a moment when leaving feels possible. And then one day that moment comes. For Farah Fratta, that moment came in 1992. After nearly a decade of marriage, Farah filed for divorce. It was not a decision made lightly. It was not made out of anger or impulse. It was made by a woman who had finally decided that she and her children deserved better than what Robert Fratta had given them. She wanted out. She wanted her life back. She wanted to be free. She had no idea what that decision would cost her. For most people, the end of a marriage, however painful, is the beginning of a new chapter. A grief to be processed, a life to be rebuilt, a future that still holds something worth reaching for. For Robert Fratta, the divorce filing was something else entirely. It was a threat, not to his heart, not to his sense of family or love or loss. There is little evidence that any of those things ever genuinely registered for him. What the divorce threatened was something Robert Fratta valued far more: control, power, money. The children he saw not as people to be loved, but as leverage to be held, and the alimony payments he had absolutely no intention of making. Something shifted in him when those papers were filed. Something that had perhaps always been there, quietly, patiently waiting, finally stepped into the open. He began talking, not in whispers, not in guarded, careful conversations between trusted friends. He began talking openly, recklessly, in the one place where men go to feel powerful, the gym. At his local Houston gym, surrounded by barbells and sweat and men who barely knew him, Robert Fratta began saying out loud what any reasonable person would have been terrified to even think. He told one contact with a casualness that should have stopped every person in earshot cold. "I'll just kill her, and I'll do my time, and when I get out, I'll have my kids." Read that again. He said that out loud to someone at his gym. Not in a moment of rage, not in the heat of an argument, just a statement, a plan delivered like a weather forecast. And it wasn't a one-time slip. Investigators would later speak to more than a dozen people, more than a dozen gym contacts, who confirmed that Robert Fratta spoke frequently, repeatedly, and openly about wanting his estranged wife dead. He said it to people he barely knew. He said it to near strangers. He said it as though it were the most reasonable solution in the world. And then he stopped just saying it. He began asking for help. Over the course of 1992 into 1994, Fratta actively approached multiple people, looking for someone, anyone, willing to help him find a hitman. He wasn't shy about it. He wasn't subtle. He asked, was refused, moved on, and asked someone else. Person after person turned him down. And each time, rather than stopping, rather than stepping back and recognizing the line he was approaching, he simply found the next person on the list. Most men, when rejected enough times, eventually accept that what they want is not available. Robert Fratta was not most men, Sometime in the early months of 1994, Fratta found the person who would not say no. Oh, his name was Joseph Priestash. Another face from the same gym circuit, another acquaintance in the world. Fratta had been quietly canvassing for years. Priestash agreed to help. And Priestash, in turn, knew someone who he believed would be willing to do what needed to be done. That someone was Howard Paul Guidry, 18 years old. Think about that for a moment. The man responsible for keeping Missouri City safe, a police officer, a firefighter, was now sitting across from an 18-year-old boy negotiating the price of his estranged wife's life. And the number they landed on was somewhere between $1,000 and $3,000 in cash, plus a Jeep. Farah Fahmida Bakir's life, her laughter, her love for her children, her future, everything she was and everything she would have become was exchanged for a used vehicle and a few $1,000s. That is the transaction Robert Fratta made. Cold, calculated, final. The plan itself was straightforward. Guidry would go to Farah's home in Atascocita, a quiet community in Harris County, northeast of Houston, and wait. Priestash would drive the getaway car, and Fratta would be somewhere else entirely, somewhere public, somewhere surrounded by witnesses, somewhere no one could ever point to him. He had thought of everything. November 9th, 1994. Farah Fratta was 8 days away from her divorce being finalized. 8 days. After years of fighting, after the abuse, the manipulation, the court battles, the long and exhausting road to freedom, she was 8 days from the other side. That evening, Robert Fratta gathered his children, including 7-year-old Bradley, and drove them to a church religious class in Missouri City. He sat among families. He sat among people of faith. He sat in one of the few spaces in the world built entirely around the idea that human life is sacred. And he waited for his pager to go off. A woman named Jean Johnson was present at that church class that evening. She would later tell investigators something that stayed with everyone who heard it. She noticed Fratta getting up repeatedly throughout the class, walking out, checking his pager, returning to his seat, over and over. A man who could not sit still. A man who was waiting for news. Meanwhile, in Atascocita, Farah pulled her car into the garage of her home. It had been a long day. She was tired, and she was close, so close, to the life she had been fighting for. She stepped out of her car. Howard Guidry was waiting inside that garage. He shot her twice in the head. Farah Fahmida Bakir died in her own garage, 8 days before she would have been free. Joseph Priestash was parked nearby. Guidry walked out of that garage, got into the car, and they were gone. The street went quiet again. The suburban night in Atascocita looked exactly the way it always did, calm, ordinary, undisturbed. And back at the church in Missouri City, Robert Fratta's pager buzzed one final time. He checked it. He returned to his seat. He did not flinch. He did not break. He simply sat there, a father, a public safety officer, a church-going member of his community, and waited for the evening to end. After the class let out, Fratta drove his children to Farah's house in Atascocita. Harris County Sheriff's deputies were already on scene when he arrived. The lights were flashing. There was activity outside the home. And Robert Fratta, pulling up to the house where his wife had just been murdered on his orders, looked at his 7-year-old son Bradley and said 2 words. "Wait in the car." He walked toward the officers. And then, in what can only be described as one of the most chilling performances in the entire history of this case, he played the role of the grieving husband, the shocked father, the devastated public servant who had just lost his wife to a senseless act of violence. He stood among fellow officers, men who wore the same badge he did, and he lied to every single one of their faces. Nobody suspected him, not that night. And in the days that followed, Fratta continued living inside that performance. He arranged for the children, he spoke to investigators, he presented himself as a man destroyed by grief, and then he did something that revealed exactly who he really was. Within days of Farah's murder, before the grief was even supposed to have settled, before the ground had closed over everything she had been, Robert Fratta attempted to collect her life insurance policy. Not weeks later, days. It was a move so premature, so nakedly calculating, that it immediately raised red flags with investigators. A grieving husband does not rush to collect life insurance. A man who planned the murder of his wife does. Robert Fratta had built what he believed was the perfect crime. He had recruited carefully. Eventually, he had constructed an airtight alibi. Yet he had positioned himself in a church, surrounded by witnesses at the exact moment the trigger was pulled. He had played his part flawlessly in the aftermath. He had even moved toward the financial reward he had calculated into the plan from the beginning. He had thought of everything. Almost. Because somewhere across Houston, an 18-year-old boy named Howard Paul Guidry was walking around the city with a murder weapon and a habit of making very bad decisions. And Robert Fratta, for all of his careful planning, had forgotten one fundamental truth about building a crime on the backs of other people. You cannot control what they do next. There is a particular kind of arrogance that lives inside people who believe they have committed the perfect crime. It is quiet at first, barely noticeable. It looks like confidence, and it looks like a man who sleeps well at night, who goes about his days without flinching, who has convinced himself that the worst is behind him and that the world will never know what he has done. Robert Fratta had that arrogance. He had earned it in his own mind. He had planned carefully. He had recruited carefully. Eventually, he had positioned himself behind an alibi so clean it could have been framed and hung on a wall. He had performed grief convincingly enough to stand among fellow officers at a crime scene of his own making and walk away without a single pair of handcuffs on his wrists. He believed he had won. But there is something about guilt that Robert Fratta did not account for. Something he could not plan around, could not control, could not negotiate away with cash and a Jeep. And that something had a name, a Howard Paul Guidry. Months passed after the murder of Farah Fratta. The investigation continued. Detectives in Harris County had questions. There were always questions in a case like this. But no clean answers were coming quickly. The case was not cold, but it was not breaking open either. And then, in 1995, in a moment that had absolutely nothing to do with Farah Fratta, Howard Guidry made a decision that would collapse Robert Fratta's entire carefully constructed world. He robbed a bank, not connected to the murder, not part of any plan. Just a young man barely out of his teenage years, making a catastrophically bad decision in broad daylight. Howard Guidry, the same Howard Guidry who had stood in a garage in Atascocita and fired 2 bullets into the head of a 33-year-old mother of 3, was arrested for an unrelated bank robbery in Houston in 1995. And when investigators processed that arrest, they found the murder weapon. The same gun used to kill Farah Fratta was recovered during Howard Guidry's bank robbery arrest. Let that land for a moment. After everything, after the planning, after the payment, after the execution of what Robert Fratta believed was a flawless crime, the weapon that connected everything was still out there, still in the hands of the 18-year-old he had trusted to disappear quietly, still capable of telling the whole story to anyone willing to listen. And Howard Guidry, faced with the weight of what that weapon meant, began to talk. And he confessed to the murder of Farah Fratta. He told investigators everything by the plan, the garage, the shots, the getaway. He named Joseph Priestash as the man who drove the car. He laid out the chain of events with a clarity that left investigators no room for doubt. Priestash was arrested, and Priestash, now facing the full weight of what he had participated in, gave up the name that investigators had been working toward all along. Robert Allen Fratta, the police officer, the firefighter, the grieving husband who had stood at the crime scene and lied to the faces of his own colleagues, the man who had rushed to collect his dead wife's life insurance within days of her murder, the man who had talked about killing her openly at a gym to more than a dozen people, and somehow believed that none of it would ever find its way back to him. And in 1995, approximately 1 year after Farah was murdered, Robert Allen Fratta was arrested. The perfect crime had lasted less than 12 months. In 1996, Robert Fratta stood trial for capital murder in Harris County, Texas. The prosecution laid out the case. The conspiracy, the payment, the gym confessions, the pager activity on the night of the murder, the insurance grab, the testimony of co-conspirators. They painted a portrait of a man who had not snapped in a moment of rage, had not acted out of grief or desperation, but had planned the death of his wife with the same cold deliberation he might have brought to any other logistical problem in his life. The jury heard it all, and then they went to deliberate. They were back in less than 1 hour. Guilty. Robert Allen Fratta was sentenced to death. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the story had reached its natural end. The man who had ordered the murder of Farah Fratta had been found guilty by a jury of his peers in under 60 minutes. Justice, delayed by a year of investigation and a trial, had finally arrived. But the legal system in the United States is not a single door. It is a hallway full of doors. And Robert Fratta, with time now stretching out ahead of him on death row, had every intention of trying every single one of them. A federal judge eventually overturned the 1996 conviction. The ruling was technical. The confessions of the co-conspirators, Priestash and Guidry, had been used at trial in a way that the court found inadmissible. On those grounds, the conviction was thrown out and Fratta was granted a retrial. But here is what the federal judge did not do. And he did not pretend that Robert Fratta was a misunderstood man. He did not soften the language of his opinion out of legal courtesy. Even while overturning the verdict, even while handing Fratta a legal lifeline, the judge took a moment to put something on record. He described Robert Allen Fratta as egotistical, misogynistic, and vile, with a callous desire to kill his wife. Those were the words of a federal judge, in a written legal opinion, about the man who was now walking away from a death sentence on a technicality. April 2009, Harris County Courthouse, Houston, Texas. Robert Fratta sat at the defense table for the second time, facing the same charge, capital murder, in the same county where his wife had been killed nearly 15 years earlier. The retrial stretched across nearly 2 weeks, while more than a dozen witnesses took the stand. The prosecution rebuilt their case, this time without relying on the inadmissible confessions that had undone the first conviction. But the moment that no one in that courtroom would ever forget, the moment that cut through every legal argument, every procedural technicality, every carefully constructed defense, came when Fratta's own children walked to the witness stand. They were adults now. Bradley was 22 years old. The children who had sat in that church pew on the night of November 9th, 1994, not knowing what their father had set in motion, had grown up. They had lived through the murder of their mother, the arrest of their father, the first trial, the appeal, the years of waiting, and now a second trial. They had carried the weight of all of it, and they had chosen a side. And they testified against him, not reluctantly, not with ambivalence. They sat in that witness box, and they told the truth about what they knew, what they remembered, what they had witnessed. And in doing so, they stripped away the last remaining image Robert Fratta had ever tried to project, that of a father, a family man, a man who, whatever else he had done, had loved his children. They did not call him Dad. They did not call him Father. They called him Bob. That single detail, 2 letters, 1 syllable, said everything that years of testimony could not. These were not children who had complicated feelings about a flawed parent. These were adults who had looked at the man across the courtroom and made a decision about who he was and what he deserved. Bradley Baker took the stand and testified about the night of November 9th, 1994. He was 7 years old when it happened. He remembered the pager, he remembered the church, he remembered being driven to his mother's house after class, seeing the police cars, the lights, and he remembered his father looking at him and saying, "Wait in the car." A 7-year-old boy told to wait in the car while his father walked toward the crime scene he had orchestrated. 15 years later, that same boy, now a man, sat in a courtroom and made sure the jury heard exactly what he remembered. On May 14th, 2009, after approximately 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict: guilty. Death sentence reinstated. Robert Fratta returned to death row, and the years began to pass. He filed appeals. That is what people on death row do. They file appeals, they search for procedural errors, they look for any crack in the legal structure that might let in a sliver of light. Fratta was no different. He worked through the system methodically, the same way he had once worked through a list of potential hitmen at a Houston gym, patiently, persistently, refusing to accept that the answer was always going to be no. In 2012, a filmmaker named Werner Herzog came to Texas death row to make a documentary series called On Death Row. He interviewed several inmates, and among them was Robert Allen Fratta. The footage is striking, not because of anything dramatic Fratta says or does, but because of what is absent. There is no visible remorse, no grief for what was lost, no acknowledgement of Fratta as a person, a mother, a human being whose life mattered. Fratta sits on camera, calculated and composed. He presenting himself to the world one more time the same way he always had, as a man who believes he is smarter than the room he is sitting in. The documentary aired, the world watched, and Robert Fratta remained on death row. In 2018, he mounted what would become one of his most technical legal challenges. He argued that advances in ballistic testing technology, had they been available at the time of his trials, could have cast doubt on whether the recovered murder weapon was definitively linked to the crime. It was a careful argument, built on the premise that science had moved forward and that the jury had been presented with conclusions that newer methods might not support. The courts rejected it. The years continued to pass. On October 11th, 2022, the judge signed this order that Robert Fratta had spent nearly 3 decades trying to prevent an execution date. January 10th, 2023, 6 o'clock in the evening, the Walls Unit, Huntsville State Penitentiary, Huntsville, Texas. His legal team made their final moves. They petitioned the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, the body with the authority to recommend a commutation of sentence, to convert a death sentence to life in prison, or to grant a 60-day reprieve that might allow for further review. It is one of the last formal avenues available to a condemned person in Texas, one of the last chances for mercy from the state. The board voted unanimously. No commutation, no reprieve, no mercy. Every avenue had been tried. Every door had been closed. After 28 years on death row, after 2 trials, and after federal appeals and state appeals and arguments about ballistic evidence and inadmissible confessions and hypnotized witnesses, Robert Allen Fratta had run out of road. January 10th, 2023. The morning of the execution brought one final, extraordinary twist, the kind that seemed almost designed by the story itself, as though it needed one last moment of chaos before it could end. Texas Civil Court Judge Catherine Motze issued a temporary injunction blocking the execution. Her ruling was specific and serious. She found that the state of Texas was planning to use compounded pentobarbital, the drug used in lethal injections, that carried expiration dates as far back as 2019. Under the Texas Pharmacy Act and the Texas Controlled Substances Act, using expired compounded drugs in this manner was, she ruled, a violation of state law. The execution could not proceed. For hours, the Walls Unit in Huntsville held its breath. The execution was on hold. Legal filings were moving through the courts at a pace that matched the urgency of what was at stake. Fratta's attorneys saw a window. The state moved to close it. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned Judge Motze's injunction. The Texas Supreme Court rejected the next appeal, and in Washington, the United States Supreme Court declined to intervene, simultaneously turning away Fratta's separate, long-standing appeal regarding the eyewitness who had changed her account of the night of the murder. After being hypnotized by investigators prior to trial, that appeal, which had argued her altered testimony had unfairly influenced the case against him, was dismissed without comment. One by one, every legal door in the country closed. By early evening on January 10th, 2023, there was nothing left. The execution began approximately 1.5 hours behind schedule, delayed by the morning's legal drama but not stopped by it. Robert Allen Fratta was brought into the execution chamber at the Walls Unit in Huntsville. The room was quiet. The witnesses were in place on the other side of the glass, among them one of Farah's sons, sitting with a hoodie pulled up over his head, and Farah's brother there to represent everything that had been taken from their family 29 years earlier. The warden asked Robert Fratta if he had any final words. He had spent 28 years on death row. He had filed appeal after appeal. He had sat in front of Werner Herzog's camera and presented himself to the world. And he had stood in a courtroom twice and listened to his own children testify against him. He had had nearly 3 decades to think about what he might say when this moment arrived. His answer was 2 words. That depends. That depends. No apology, no acknowledgement of Farah, no words for his children, no explanation for the gym confessions, the Jeep, the pager, the insurance policy, the years of lies. Just 2 words that meant nothing and somehow said everything about the kind of man Robert Allen Fratta had always been. A man who, even at the very end, could not bring himself to be honest in a single, complete human sentence. The lethal injection was administered. Fratta closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. He snored loudly 6 times as consciousness left him. And then he was still. At 7:49 in the evening on January 10th, 2023, Robert Allen Fratta was pronounced dead. He was the first person executed in the state of Texas that year. He was the second person executed in the entire United States in 2023. All 3 of the men who conspired to murder Farah Fratta faced the death penalty for what they did. Howard Guidry, the 18-year-old who pulled the trigger in that Atascocita garage, was sentenced to death row. Joseph Price-Stash, who recruited Guidry and drove the getaway car, was also sentenced to death and has since died in prison while awaiting execution. 3 men, 3 death sentences, 1 plan, 1 victim, 1 woman who deserved none of it. Farah's children grew up without their mother. They grew up carrying the weight of November 9th, 1994. The church, the pager, the garage, the police lights, the man who told a 7-year-old boy to wait in the car. And they grew up sitting through trials and appeals and retrials and more appeals. They grew up watching a system work slowly, imperfectly, dalite, and at enormous cost to everyone who loved Farah, until it finally, after 29 years, reached the only conclusion that was ever right. And somewhere along the way, Farah's children made a quiet, powerful decision. They took back her name, not Fratta, not the name of the man who had their mother killed. They chose Baker, Farah's name, her family's name, the name that connected them to who she was and where she came from, and the love she had given them before anyone had the chance to take her away. That choice, that reclamation, is perhaps the most dignified thing in this entire story. In a case defined by the cold calculations of a man who valued control above all else, Farah's children found a way to make sure that the name which endured was not his, it was hers. Robert Allen Fratta was a police officer, a firefighter, a man who wore 2 uniforms and carried 2 sets of responsibilities and stood in front of his community and accepted their trust without ever intending to deserve it. He paid $3,000 and a Jeep to end the life of the mother of his children. He spent 29 years on death row in Huntsville, Texas, filing appeals, giving interviews, arguing technicalities, doing everything a man with time and lawyers and no remorse can do to avoid the consequences of what he chose. Farah Famida Bakwer never got 29 more years. She never got to watch Bradley grow into the man who stood in a courtroom at 22 and told the truth. And she never got the freedom that was 8 days away when Howard Guidry walked into her garage. She never got the future she had fought so hard to reach. But on January 10th, 2023, at 7:49 in the evening, in a witness room in Huntsville, Texas, her son and her brother were there. They were there for her. They watched. They witnessed. And in the silence of that room, on the other side of 29 years of pain and patience and love that refused to disappear, they said goodbye. Do you think justice was truly served after 29 years? Drop your answer in the comments below. We read every single one, and if this story moved you, if it made you feel something, if you believe Farah's story deserved to be told, subscribe to this channel, because there are more stories like this one, more cases, more names that deserve to be remembered. We will be here.
You go to your execution with a clean heart, with
Yes,
knowing that, feeling you have done nothing wrong.
yes,
Does that help you at this time?
yes, it helps me. It gives me the strength to face it all.
It was a warm August night on Cedar Creek Lake in Texas when a fisherman spotted something strange drifting near the shore. A boat completely empty. No fishermen, no gear, no struggle. Just a quiet vessel rocking on the water, its propeller missing, a bottle of heart medication scattered across the floor. The man who owned that boat was Jimmy Don Beats, a decorated Dallas fire captain, a father, a husband, and he was gone without a trace. No body, no witnesses, no answers. Back at the house, his wife Betty sat calm as still water. No tears, no panic, no sleepless nights pacing the porch. In fact, within 48 hours, she was already at the fire department collecting his paycheck. So here's the question I need you to sit with right now. What kind of woman doesn't cry when her husband disappears? And that question, that unsettling gut punch of a question, is exactly why you're on the right channel. Welcome to True Crime Corner, where we don't just tell you what happened. We show you what the warning signs looked like, so you never miss them in real life. Now listen, if you are not subscribed yet, I need you to fix that right now, not at the end of this video. Now, because the story you're about to hear is going to get darker, more twisted, and more shocking with every single minute. And I would hate for you to miss a single second of it, because the algorithm decided you weren't a regular here. Hit that subscribe button, one tap, let's go. To understand how a woman ends up on death row, you have to go back to where her story actually began. Not at the lake, not at the crime scene, but in a pine cabin in Roxborough, North Carolina, where a little girl named Betty Lou Dooney Vant came into a world that had already decided she didn't matter much. Her family were sharecroppers. No electricity, no running water, no glass in the windows. Just survival, day after day on land that wasn't even theirs. When Betty was around 5 years old, she contracted measles. The fever burned so hot, so long, that by the time it broke, her hearing was gone. Profoundly deaf, in a poor rural household, with no resources, no specialist, no hearing aid. She wouldn't receive her first hearing aid until she was nearly 40 years old. But the silence wasn't even the worst of it. Betty later claimed her father began sexually abusing her at a young age. And when she was just 12 years old, her mother suffered a severe psychotic breakdown and was institutionalized, leaving Betty to cook, clean, and raise her younger siblings alone. She was 12, a child mothering children. By 15, she had already decided there was only one way out of that house, and that was marriage. At 15, Betty dropped out of the 9th grade and married her first husband, Robert Franklin Branson. She thought she was escaping. What she actually did was trade one kind of pain for another. The marriage lasted 17 years and produced 6 children. Betty claimed Robert was controlling, violent, and unpredictable, that the abuse never really stopped. It just changed shape depending on the day. By 1969, she had attempted suicide 3 times. 3 times. That is not a woman living, that is a woman enduring. After the divorce, she married Billy York Lane. He broke her nose. She shot him twice in the back. She was charged with attempted murder, but the charges were dropped when Lane admitted he had threatened her life first. They divorced, remarried out of desperation, and divorced again by 1973. Here is where I want to pause and speak directly to you for a moment, because what we're watching here is a cycle, one that millions of people get trapped in every single year. You leave one dangerous situation, and because no one teaches you what healthy love actually looks like, you walk straight into another one. Betty didn't have therapy. She didn't have a support system. She had 6 kids, a 9th grade education, profound hearing loss, and a deep, unshakable belief that she was only worth something if a man wanted her. That belief would eventually cost 2 men their lives. Her third marriage to Ronnie Threlkeld was volatile from the start. He later described her as someone who came after him with a tire iron when she felt threatened. By now, Betty had been hit, controlled, humiliated, and cornered so many times that something in her had fundamentally shifted. She wasn't running anymore. Then came husband number 4, a construction worker named Doyle Wayne Barker. Neighbors remembered seeing Betty with black eyes, choke marks on her neck, bruises covering her arms. The relationship was brutal by any account. And then one day in 1981, Doyle Wayne Barker simply vanished. Betty told neighbors he had stepped out to buy cigarettes. He never came back. Everyone assumed he had walked out. No one looked too hard. No one asked too many questions. A man leaves his wife. It happens, right? Except, here is where this story turns. When investigators finally came for Betty Lou Beets in 1985, they didn't just find one body. They found Doyle Wayne Barker buried 3 feet underground in her backyard, right beneath the shed, shot in the head, wrapped in a sleeping bag. He never went for cigarettes. He never left at all. And the husband before him, Jimmy Don Beets, the one whose empty boat started all of this, he was buried in the front yard, inside the ornamental wishing well that he had built with his own hands just days before she killed him. 2 husbands, 2 graves, 1 property. And not a single neighbor ever suspected a thing. 2 graves, 1 front yard, 1 backyard. And we are barely halfway through this story. I need you to stop right here and drop a comment below. Victim, villain, or both. Because right now, in this moment, what do you think Betty Lou Beets was? I promise you, your answer is going to change before this video is over. And if it doesn't, you weren't paying close enough attention. Betty met Jimmy Don Beets in the summer of 1982 at the Cedar Club, a lakeside bar where she worked as a bartender. He was charming, financially stable, and completely taken with her. By August 19, 1982, they were married and settled into Betty's mobile home near Cedar Creek Lake in Gun Barrel City, Texas. From the outside, it looked like Betty had finally found solid ground. But inside that home, according to Betty, the abuse started almost immediately. She claimed Jimmy Don was controlling, jealous, and violent behind closed doors. That the man the fire department knew as a respected captain was a very different man when no one was watching. Whether that was true, partially true, or a story carefully constructed for survival, we may never fully know. What we do know is this: Betty had already buried 1 husband in that backyard. And somewhere between the wedding and the first anniversary, she had made a decision about Jimmy Don too. In the weeks leading up to August 6, 1983, Betty told her son Robbie to stay away from the house. She told him plainly, with no apparent distress, no hesitation, that she intended to kill Jimmy. Let that sit for a moment. This was not a snap decision made in the heat of an argument. This was planned, spoken out loud, to her own child. On the night of August 6th, Jimmy Don Beets was shot twice in the head at close range with a .38 caliber pistol. Robbie returned to the house and helped his mother wrap the body in a blue sleeping bag. Together, they buried Jimmy Don beneath the ornamental wishing well in the front yard, the same wishing well he had filled with peat moss and flowers just days before his death. The next morning, Betty reported her husband missing. She told investigators she had been shopping in Dallas all day and came home to an empty house. She was composed, articulate, cooperative. When she arrived at the marina later that night to speak with searchers, witnesses noted she was fully made up, hair done, face on, completely calm, while a search team dragged the lake for her husband's body. Within 48 hours, she was at the Dallas Fire Department collecting his paycheck. Within weeks, she had selected a casket, chosen a burial plot, and opened legal proceedings to have Jimmy Don declared dead so she could claim his pension, his life insurance, and his fire department survivor benefits. A total payout of approximately $180,000. The lake gave up nothing. The yard gave up everything. For nearly 2 years, the case sat cold. The lake had been searched for 13 days. No body, no weapon, no witnesses. Investigators had nothing concrete to move on, and without a body, there was no crime, at least not one they could prove. Betty, meanwhile, was quietly collecting Jimmy Don's benefits, living her life, and had already moved on to a new boyfriend named Ray Bone. Jimmy Don's son, Jamie, had been suspicious of Betty from the very beginning. He told investigators she was cold, that something wasn't right, that his father wouldn't just vanish. But grief-stricken family members raising suspicions about a widow is not unusual, and without evidence, his warnings went largely unheeded. Then, in late April 1985, everything changed. A small-time informant came forward with a story that stopped investigators cold. He had been with Betty at a motel, and after a few drinks, she had made a remark that he couldn't shake. She told him, almost casually, "You wouldn't think it was so funny if you knew that the last son of a bitch I laid up with, I buried in the front yard." He passed a polygraph. Investigators then located Betty's daughter Phyllis, who confirmed she had heard from her brother Robbie that their mother had killed Jimmy Don and buried him on the property. Phyllis then dropped a second revelation that nobody was fully prepared for. Doyle Wayne Barker, Betty's fourth husband, who had supposedly left for cigarettes 4 years earlier, was buried there too. On June 8, 1985, Betty Lou Beets was arrested in Mansfield alongside her boyfriend Ray Bone. A search warrant was obtained, and investigators moved to the property at Cherokee Shores with a backhoe. They started with the front yard. The ornamental wishing well, the one Jimmy Don had built himself, the one Betty had kept watered and decorated, was knocked over. A foot below the soil, inside a blue sleeping bag, were the decomposed remains of Jimmy Don Beets, 2 bullet wounds to the head. The backhoe then moved to the backyard. The shed came down. 3 feet underground, another sleeping bag, the remains of Doyle Wayne Barker, also shot in the head, also wrapped and buried like a secret nobody was ever supposed to find, both men. Same property, same method, same woman. Jamie Beets, who had spent 2 years being dismissed as an emotional son who couldn't accept his father, was gone, stood at that scene and felt something land in his chest that was equal parts relief and devastation. He had been right all along. He just wished, more than anything, that he hadn't been. 2 bodies, 2 bullet wounds. 2 families who'd spent years not knowing where their loved ones were buried. If you know someone, anyone, who has ever brushed off the warning signs in a relationship or made excuses for a partner who gave them reasons to be afraid, share this video with them right now. Not to scare them, not to lecture them, but because Betty Lou Beets' story is a masterclass in what happens when red flags get ignored long enough. Sharing this video could genuinely change someone's life. Don't keep this to yourself. Betty Lou Beets went to trial in October 1985, pleading not guilty. Her defense strategy was a striking one. She pointed the finger directly at her own children, arguing that Robbie and her daughter Shirley had fabricated their testimony in exchange for prosecutorial leniency. She maintained that she had not pulled the trigger, that she had been set up by the very people she had raised. The jury didn't buy it. Robbie and Shirley took the stand and testified in precise, damaging detail. They described how their mother had planned the killing deliberately, how she had told Robbie in advance, how the burial had been carried out methodically and without panic. There was nothing impulsive about any of it. Prosecutors built their case around one word: remuneration. Under Texas law, murder for financial gain is a capital offense, and the evidence of Betty's financial motive was overwhelming. The pension, the life insurance, the survivor benefits, the speed with which she had moved to have Jimmy Don declared legally dead. Everything pointed to a woman who had looked at her husband and seen a payout. But here is the part of this story that should make you deeply uncomfortable, because it speaks to a failure far bigger than Betty Lou Beets herself. Mental health experts had evaluated Betty and documented evidence of battered woman syndrome, post-traumatic stress disorder, and organic brain damage, all directly connected to decades of sustained abuse. That evidence existed. It was available. It was relevant. Her defense attorney never introduced a single piece of it. He had, however, reportedly been in negotiations to sell the media rights to Betty's story. Not one juror ever heard about the abuse. Not one juror was asked to consider whether a lifetime of trauma had fractured Betty's ability to process, respond to, or escape violence in the ways that a person with a stable, protected upbringing might have. On October 11, 1985, Betty Lou Beets was convicted of capital murder. 3 days later, the jury sentenced her to death by lethal injection. She was 48 years old. And the question that her case leaves behind, the one that no verdict has ever fully answered, is this: when the justice system fails a victim so completely that she becomes a killer, who bears the weight of that? Betty Lou Beets arrived at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas in October 1985. She later recalled that when she first heard the screaming echoing through the corridors at night, the cries of psychiatric inmates housed in the same facility, she genuinely believed she had been placed in a mental institution. The reality of where she was took time to fully land. But once it did, something unexpected happened. Betty didn't harden. She didn't rage against the walls or spend her years filing angry appeals through gritted teeth. Instead, she went quiet, and then she went inward. She joined a small group of women on death row who had quietly renamed their unit Life Row, because, as Betty explained it, Jesus lives here. Every Wednesday brought Bible study. Every morning brought scripture. Faith, for Betty, became the first stable and undemanding relationship she had ever known, one that asked nothing of her except presence. She learned to make quilts. She painted toddler dolls by hand, delicate, detailed work that buyers reportedly waited up to a year to receive. 6 hours a day, needle and thread and paintbrush, turning a death row cell into something that looked, from the inside, almost like peace. By the mid-1990s, journalists who visited Betty described a white-haired, soft-spoken grandmother of 9 who wore tiny gold crosses and spoke about grace with the quiet conviction of someone who had genuinely found it, or had decided, at minimum, to build her life around the search for it. She continued to maintain her innocence until the end. She never stopped insisting her children had lied. Whether that was truth, denial, or simply the only story that allowed her to keep breathing, only Betty knew. But here is what I want you to take from this section. Transformation is real. People can change inside the worst circumstances imaginable. And yet, transformation does not erase consequence. Growth does not cancel accountability. Betty became, by most accounts, a genuinely different woman on death row. The state of Texas executed her anyway. Amnesty International filed urgent appeals. Anti-domestic violence organizations argued that her case represented everything broken about a justice system. Betty's daughters stood before the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles with photographs, images of a battered, bruised woman, and begged, with everything they had, for their mother's life to be spared. The board voted against clemency. The case then landed on the desk of Governor George W. Bush, who, during his time as Texas governor, oversaw more executions than any governor in modern American history. Bush reviewed the case and issued a brief, unmoved statement. After careful review of the evidence in the case, I concur with the jury that Betty Lou Beets is guilty of this murder. I will not grant a 30-day delay. On the night of February 24, 2000, Betty Lou Beets was transferred to the Huntsville unit, the same facility where Texas has carried out every execution since 1982. No members of the Beets family came to support her. She faced her final hours without a single familiar face on her side of the glass. She refused her last meal. When she was strapped to the gurney inside the execution chamber, 2 men sat in the witness room watching: Jamie Beets, Jimmy Don's son, and Rodney Barker, the son of Doyle Wayne Barker. Both had waited 15 years for this moment. Rodney said afterward, "I felt a lot of burden off of me. It's just like a lot of weight off me." Betty Lou Beets was pronounced dead by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit on February 24, 2000. She was 62 years old, the oldest person executed in Texas since the reinstatement of the death penalty, and the 4th woman executed in the United States since 1976. No last words were recorded, just silence. The same silence that had followed her entire life. Betty Lou Beets was not born a killer. She was born into poverty, into abuse, into silence, literal and emotional. She grew up in a world that taught her she had no value outside of the men who claimed her, and no escape except the ones she invented for herself. And the escapes she invented ultimately were devastating. So what do we actually take from this story? First, cycles of abuse do not break themselves. Betty moved from one violent relationship to the next, not because she was weak, but because nobody ever showed her the exit. If you are in a relationship right now where you feel controlled, afraid, or consistently small, that is not love. That is a pattern. And patterns, unlike people, can be broken, but only if you decide to break them before they break you. Second, financial red flags are real flags. Betty killed for money. But the deeper truth is that financial dependence trapped her inside relationships she couldn't afford to leave. If your entire survival depends on one person, leaving becomes almost impossible. Build your own financial ground. It is not unromantic, it is survival. Third, when children raise warnings, listen. Jamie Beets spent 2 years telling anyone who would hear him that something was wrong. He was dismissed. 2 bodies were in that yard the entire time. The people closest to a situation often see it clearest. Don't let grief or discomfort silence the voices that might be saving a life. Betty Lou Beets' story is not just a crime story. It is a warning about what unaddressed trauma looks like when it reaches its absolute limit, and about all the moments along the way where a different intervention could have changed everything. For everyone. If you made it this far, you already know this channel is different. We don't just tell you what happened. We show you why it matters, what it means, and what you can do with it. So if you are still not subscribed, I genuinely don't know what more this channel has to do to earn that tap. 1 button, that's all. Hit subscribe and make sure you never miss a story like this one again. And if for some reason you're still hesitating, drop a comment below and tell me why. I actually read them. Now, next week we are covering a case so disturbing, so calculated, and so close to home that several people on my research team asked me not to post it. I'm posting it. Make sure you're here for it. 3 bodies buried underground beneath someone else's grave, In a Memphis cemetery, a mother, her son, and a 17-year-old boy who had his whole life ahead of him. Someone put them there. Someone planned it. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. And the state of Tennessee says they know who that someone is. But here is the part they don't want you to think too hard about. The fingerprints at that crime scene don't match him. The DNA found on the blanket those bodies were buried in doesn't match him. The only eyewitness who was actually present at those murders looked investigators in the eye in 2011 and said it wasn't him. And then, that same witness gave them a name. A specific name. A real person. Someone whose DNA and fingerprints are sitting in a law enforcement database right now. Today, at this very moment, all Tennessee had to do was run one test. 1. They have refused to do it for 15 years. The question is, why? Why would a state fight that hard? To avoid finding out the truth. Welcome to True Crime Corner. Today's case, the state of Tennessee versus Tony Von Carruthers. If you are new here, subscribe to our channel right now so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment below. Tell us where in the world you are watching from. Now, let's get into it. South Memphis, Tennessee, 1994. If you have never been to South Memphis, let me paint the picture for you. It is a neighborhood that carries the weight of a city that has seen too much. Streets lined with modest homes. Families who know each other by name. Where a mother knows every child on the block and every child knows her name. Delois Anderson was that kind of woman. 43 years old. A mother. A presence in her community on the south side of Memphis, Tennessee. The kind of woman whose home was a place people came to. Not just her family, but the people her family loved. Her son Marcelos was 21 years old. 21. That age where a young man is just beginning to understand who he is. Just beginning to figure out what his life is going to look like. He lived close to his mother the way sons do in tight-knit families, not because he had to, but because that was just how things were. That was home. And then there was Frederick Tucker, 17 years old, a teenager, not yet a man, no longer quite a boy. 17 is the age where the whole world feels like it is just beginning to open up. School, friends, plans, dreams. Frederick Tucker was 17 years old in 1994, and he had every reason in the world to believe that the best parts of his life were still ahead of him. These are the three people at the center of this story. Not case numbers, not evidence files, not names in a court document. Three real human beings, a mother, her son, and a teenage boy, who woke up one morning in South Memphis, Tennessee in 1994 and never came home. At some point in 1994, Delois Anderson, Marcelos Anderson, and Frederick Tucker were abducted. Not from a street corner, not from a parking lot, not from some unfamiliar place where danger might be expected. They were taken from Delois Anderson's own home, the place where she slept, the place where she raised her son, the one place in the world that is supposed to be safe from everything outside its walls. Someone came through that boundary. Someone crossed into the one space that was theirs. And they took all three of them. And then silence. For an entire week, the families of Delois Anderson, Marcelos Anderson, and Frederick Tucker heard nothing. No phone call, no ransom demand, no anonymous tip, no body, no trace, just silence and the specific kind of terror that lives in not knowing. If you have ever waited for news that does not come, you understand what that week felt like. Every hour longer than the last. Every knock on the door that is not the right knock. Every phone call that is not the one you are waiting for. An entire week of that, 7 days. And then investigators found them. In a cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee, all three bodies were recovered. But the manner in which they were found is the detail that I need you to sit with for a moment. Because it is the detail that tells you everything you need to know about the kind of person or people responsible for what happened to Delois, Marcelos, and Frederick. They were not simply buried in the ground. They were buried beneath someone else's casket, deliberately placed underneath an existing grave, hidden in a way that required knowledge of the cemetery, access to the burial site, and a significant amount of time and physical effort. This was not a panic burial. This was not someone who committed a terrible act and desperately tried to hide the evidence in the nearest available place. This was deliberate. This was calculated. This was planned. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about the level of cold, methodical thinking required to look at three human beings. A mother, her grown son, a 17-year-old child, and then proceed to conceal them beneath an existing grave in a public cemetery. That is not the behavior of someone who lost control. That is the behavior of someone who believed they had thought of everything. Someone who believed they would never be found out. The city of Memphis was shaken. Three people gone from their home, found buried under another person's grave. The kind of case that makes an entire community look over their shoulder. The kind of case that demands answers, and law enforcement moved to find them. In 1994 and into 1995, 3 men were arrested in connection with the murders of Delois Anderson, Marcellos Anderson, and Frederick Tucker. Their names were Tony Von Carruthers, James Montgomery, and a third co-defendant. 3 arrests. 3 people the state of Tennessee believed were responsible for what happened in that South Memphis home and in that Memphis cemetery. Now, here is where this story begins to shift. Because when the prosecution began building their case, when investigators and attorneys sat down to assemble the evidence that would be presented in a court of law to justify sending these men to prison, or in Carruth's case, to death, something became very clear. There was no murder weapon. There was no DNA linking Tony Von Carruthers to the crime scene. There was not a single fingerprint match connecting him to the location where those 3 people were abducted or buried. There was no physical evidence of any kind that placed Tony Von Carruthers at the scene of these murders. Nothing. What the prosecution did have was a man named Alfredo Shaw, a man being held in custody in Memphis. A man who came forward and told investigators that while he and Tony Von Carruthers were both in jail, Carruthers had confessed to him, that Carruthers had told him in detail what he had done. Shaw was prepared to take the stand and say all of this in open court, and the prosecution decided that was enough. One man's word. No corroboration, no physical evidence to support it, no independent verification of any kind. Just Alfredo Shaw and whatever he was prepared to say from that witness stand. That is all the state of Tennessee had, and they decided it was sufficient to seek the death penalty. What the defense did not know, what the jury did not know, what the court itself was never told, was who Alfredo Shaw actually was. Because Alfredo Shaw was not simply a fellow inmate who happened to overhear something. Alfredo Shaw was a paid career jailhouse informant, a man with a documented history of providing testimony for the state in exchange for compensation and favorable treatment. A man whose entire track record of cooperation with prosecutors was, at the time of Tony Von Carruthers' trial, completely hidden from everyone in that courtroom who was not the prosecution. The state knew. They knew exactly who Alfredo Shaw was. They knew what he did. They knew how he operated. And they put him on the stand anyway and told no one. One paid man's word. That is all the state of Tennessee had. And they sent a man to death row on it. By the time the case reached Shelby County Criminal Court in Memphis in April 1996, Tony Von Carruthers had already been through 6 court-appointed attorneys. 6. That is not a small number. That is not a clerical inconvenience. 6 lawyers, each one cycling out of the case before trial ever began. And the reason each one left, the reason the relationship between Carruthers and his legal representation kept breaking down is something that mental health experts who have since reviewed this case now attribute directly to Tony Von Carruthers' severe and documented mental illness. A condition that, left untreated or unrecognized in a legal context, manifested as the kind of behavior that made it, apparently, impossible for him to maintain a functional relationship with counsel. That is not a character flaw. That is a medical condition. And it is a medical condition that the system was not equipped or was not willing to properly address. So when the 6th attorney was gone, and the trial date was approaching, and the judge was faced with a decision, he made one. He ruled that Tony Von Carruthers, a man with severe documented mental illness, a man experiencing what experts would later describe as active psychotic delusions, a man with no legal training, no understanding of courtroom procedure, no ability to cross-examine witnesses, introduce evidence, object to inadmissible testimony, or construct a legal defense, would represent himself in a capital murder trial in Memphis, Tennessee in April 1996. A man whose own mind was working against him was handed the responsibility of saving his own life inside a system specifically designed to be navigated by trained legal professionals. He stood in that courtroom alone, no lawyer beside him, no one to whisper in his ear when the prosecution said something that needed challenging, no one to object when evidence was presented in a way that was legally improper, no one to fight for him in the language that courtroom requires. Meanwhile, his co-defendant James Montgomery had a lawyer, a full legal defense, proper representation in the same courtroom for the same charges in the same case. The outcomes could not have been more different. Montgomery's case proceeded with the benefit of competent legal counsel. He was eventually granted a new trial on the basis of issues identified by his attorneys. He later accepted a plea deal, and sometime around 2015 or 2016, James Montgomery walked out of prison. a free man back into the world, back to his life. Tony Carruthers, who stood alone in that courtroom in April 1996 with no lawyer and a mind compromised by mental illness, was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder. And he was sentenced to death. Same crime, same charges, same courtroom, Memphis, Tennessee, same April 1996. One man had a lawyer. One man did not. One man is free today. One man has been sitting on death row for 30 years, waiting for an execution date to be set on a calendar inside Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. That is not a coincidence. That is not an accident. That is the direct, documented, measurable consequence of what happens when a mentally ill man is forced to face the death penalty without legal representation in an American courtroom. And before we go any further into this story, before we get to the evidence that was never tested, the name that was never followed up on, and the secret the state of Tennessee kept buried for 30 years, I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to this channel. I am not asking you as a formality. I am asking you because this case is still moving. The legal fight around Tony Von Carruthers is not over. There are decisions being made right now, in federal courts, in the governor's office in Nashville, that will determine whether this execution happens or whether something finally stops it. And if you are not subscribed, there is a real chance the algorithm never brings this story back to your screen at the moment it matters most. These cases do not wait. The justice system does not pause while you decide whether to hit a button. Subscribe right now. Turn on the notification bell. And if for some reason you are choosing not to, go to the comments section and tell me why. Because I genuinely want to understand what it takes. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what you think of what you have heard so far. And then stay with me. Because what is coming in next is the part of this case that the state of Tennessee has spent 15 years hoping you would never find out. 30 years. That is how long the state of Tennessee kept a secret. Not a complicated secret. Not one buried in layers of classified documents or locked inside a government vault somewhere. A simple, single damning secret about one man. The only man whose testimony connected Tony Von Carruthers to the murders of Delois Anderson, Marcellus Anderson, and Frederick Tucker. His name was Alfredo Shaw. They knew exactly who Alfredo Shaw was when they put him on that stand in Shelby County Criminal Court in April 1996. They knew about his history. They knew about the arrangement. They knew that the man they were presenting to the jury as a credible, disinterested witness who just happened to hear a confession was none of those things. And they told no one. Not the defense, not the jury, not the judge. No one sitting in that courtroom in Memphis in April 1996, except the prosecutors themselves, knew the truth about Alfredo Shaw. It was not until approximately 2023 or 2024, under years of sustained legal pressure from Carruthers' attorneys, that the state of Tennessee finally acknowledged what it had always known. 30 years after a man was sentenced to die on that testimony. 30 years after a jury deliberated and returned a verdict based on information that was deliberately, consciously, strategically withheld from everyone who was supposed to weigh it. Think about what 30 years means in the life of a human being. Tony Von Carruthers was a young man when he was first placed in a cell at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee. He is now in his late 50s. 30 years of his life, his entire adult life, spent on death row for a conviction built on one man's word. A word the prosecution knew was compromised from the day they decided to use it. That is what makes this different from a mistake. Mistakes are made in the moment, in the fog of incomplete information, under pressure, with imperfect tools. What the prosecution did in the Tony Von Carruthers case was not made in a moment of fog. It was made with full knowledge. It was maintained with full knowledge. And for 3 decades, the machinery of the state of Tennessee worked to ensure that full knowledge stayed exactly where it was, buried. But even that is not the deepest layer of this case. Because while the secret about Alfredo Shaw was being kept, while Tony Von Carruthers was aging inside a cell in Nashville, something was happening on the outside that the state of Tennessee also chose to look away from. In 2011, James Montgomery sat down with investigators. James Montgomery, the co-defendant who stood in the same courtroom in Memphis in April 1996 but had a lawyer beside him. The man whose legal representation eventually secured him a new trial. The man who accepted a plea deal and walked out of prison sometime around 2015 or 2016 to resume his life. That James Montgomery in 2011 looked at investigators and told them something that should have sent shockwaves through every level of the Tennessee justice system. He told them that Tony Von Carruthers was not involved in the murders. not less involved, not peripherally involved, not involved in a way that might be argued down to a lesser charge. Not involved at all, and then Montgomery gave them a name. A specific, real, identifiable human being who he said was responsible for what happened to Delois Anderson, Marcellos Anderson, and Frederick Tucker in South Memphis in 1994. That name was Ronnie Irving, known throughout Memphis as Ronnie Eyeball Irving. Now here is the detail that transforms this from a painful story about a potentially wrongful conviction into something that genuinely defies explanation. Ronnie Eyeball Irving was murdered in 2002. He has been dead for more than 20 years. He cannot be arrested. He cannot be questioned. He cannot be brought into a courtroom. In that sense, the trail leading directly to him went cold the moment his life ended. But his fingerprints did not disappear when he died. His DNA did not disappear. Both are on file with law enforcement. Both are sitting in a database right now, today, accessible, comparable, ready to be run against any piece of physical evidence collected from any crime scene. And at the crime scene where 3 people were murdered and buried beneath a stranger's grave in a Memphis cemetery, at the scene where Tony Von Carruthers has spent 30 years being told his guilt is beyond question, investigators found 5 unidentified fingerprints. 5 sets of prints lifted from the location and never matched to any known individual. Not to Carruthers, not to Montgomery, not to anyone. They also recovered unknown male DNA from a blanket. The same blanket that was wrapped around the bodies of Delois Anderson, Marcellos Anderson, and Frederick Tucker when they were found underground in that Memphis cemetery in 1994. Unknown male DNA present on the burial blanket of 3 murder victims, never compared to a single suspect. Investigators also collected fingernail scrapings from the victims. When a person fights for their life, when they struggle and scratch against whoever is harming them, they sometimes leave biological evidence on their attacker or carry that attacker's biological material under their fingernails. Those scrapings were collected as a matter of standard homicide procedure. According to the legal filings submitted by the ACLU, they were never fully analyzed. Beyond those items, the ACLU has specifically identified 3 additional untested biological pieces of evidence were recovered from the scene. Items sitting unexamined in storage, while the man convicted of those murders sits on death row waiting for an execution date. 5 fingerprints, unknown male DNA on a burial blanket, fingernail scrapings from 3 murder victims, 3 additional untested biological items, and a name, Ronnie Eyeball Irving, whose biological profile is on file, whose fingerprints are on file, who was named by a participant in the actual murders as the man responsible, and against whom not one piece of that evidence has ever been compared. Not once. In September 2021, Tony Von Carruthers, still without legal representation, still navigating the system the same way he was forced to navigate it in that Memphis courtroom in 1996 alone, filed a motion himself. He filed it under Tennessee's Post-Conviction Fingerprint Analysis Act of 2021, a law created specifically to give death row inmates the ability to request that crime scene evidence be compared against known suspects. Carruthers identified Ronnie Irving by name. He asked the court to order law enforcement to run the 5 unidentified crime scene fingerprints against Irving's prints already on file in the system. 1 comparison. That is all he asked for. The motion was denied. His attorneys continued to fight. On April 9, 2026, the ACLU and the ACLU of Tennessee filed a formal motion in the Tennessee Supreme Court requesting that DNA testing be ordered before the scheduled execution. The filing laid out in precise legal detail every piece of untested evidence, every reason that testing was warranted, and every argument for why proceeding with an execution before that testing was completed would be a profound and irreversible injustice. On April 15, 2026, the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals denied the fingerprint petition. On April 16, 2026, the Tennessee Supreme Court upheld that denial. The court ruled, in writing on record, that there was insufficient probability that the results of forensic testing would change the outcome of the conviction. Insufficient probability, not that the test would come back negative, not that Ronnie Irving's fingerprints would not match, not that the DNA on that burial blanket would fail to connect to someone other than Tony Von Carruthers. Simply that the court did not believe there was enough of a chance that the truth, whatever it turned out to be, would matter enough to the outcome to justify finding it out. They chose not to know. On April 23, 2026, Amnesty International issued a formal declaration stating that proceeding with the execution of Tony Von Carruthers would constitute a violation of international law, They cited two specific grounds. The first was his severe and documented mental disability. The second was the fact that he was forced to represent himself in a capital murder trial in 1996. They were not framing this as a legal disagreement. They were not describing it as a miscarriage of justice in the conventional sense. They were calling it a violation of international law. On April 28, 2026, the ACLU and the law firm Quarles and Brady took the fight out of the Tennessee state court system entirely and filed a federal lawsuit in the United States District Court. Their argument was direct. The refusal to allow DNA and fingerprint testing before an execution constitutes of Tony Von Carruthers' constitutional rights. That lawsuit is still moving through federal court as this video was recorded. On May 5, 2026, Carruthers' attorneys formally submitted a clemency petition to Governor Bill Lee at his office in Nashville, Tennessee. The final appeal to the final human being inside the state who has the unilateral authority to stop this execution before it happens. On May 7, 2026, the ACLU filed another formal demand for DNA testing, brought again directly to the Tennessee Supreme Court. On May 9, 2026, Amnesty USA issued an international urgent action alert, asking advocates around the world to apply whatever pressure they could before the scheduled execution date. On May 11, 2026, ACLU Senior Counsel Maria De Liberato, who leads the Capital Punishment Project, spoke publicly about the case in a way designed to reach as wide an audience as possible. She made clear that, in her professional judgment, the evidence of possible innocence in this case is not marginal. It is not speculative. It is documented, physical, and testable, and the state is choosing not to test it. On May 12, 26, Memphis reporters Jessica Gertler, chief investigator at REG, and anchor investigator April Thompson published an interview with the father of one of the three victims. He sat in front of a camera and said clearly, "It is overdue." He said Tony Von Carruthers should pay for what was done to his family. He said he plans to be present at the execution, and that matters. That cannot be acknowledged with anything less than full weight, because this story is not only about Tony Von Carruthers. It is about Delois Anderson, who was 43 years old and lived in South Memphis and was taken from her own home. It is about Marcellos Anderson, her 21-year-old son. It is about Frederick Tucker, who was 17 years old and had no reason to believe that 1994 would be the year his life ended. It is about a father who has spent over 30 years carrying the grief of losing someone he loved and who deserves, more than anyone, to know with absolute certainty that the person being held responsible is the person actually responsible. That is not a small thing. That is everything. And it is precisely why the refusal to run this test is so impossible to justify. Because the test does not only have the potential to clear Tony Von Carruthers, it has the potential to give that father something no court ruling and no execution date can ever truly provide, the certainty that justice was aimed at the right person. There is one more dimension of this case that has been running alongside every legal filing, every court denial, every motion and petition and appeal, and it is the dimension that perhaps says the most about how this entire situation has been handled from the very beginning. While the fingerprint and DNA battles were being fought in courtrooms across Tennessee and in federal court, Carruthers' attorneys were simultaneously making a separate argument. They argued that Tony Von Carruthers is mentally incompetent to be executed, not simply mentally ill, though he is that severely and documentably. Incompetent in the specific legal sense, meaning that the psychotic delusions that have shaped his reality since before that 1996 trial are still active today. That he does not have a clear, rational, accurate understanding of why the state of Tennessee intends to end his life. A Memphis judge reviewed the evidence and ruled in early 2026 that Tony Von Carruthers is legally competent to be executed, and the state of Tennessee is proceeding. Every legal door inside Tennessee has now been closed. The Court of Criminal Appeals said no. The Tennessee Supreme Court said no. The competency challenge was denied. The federal lawsuit remains the last active legal mechanism, still moving through the United States District Court with the execution date fixed on the calendar. The clemency petition is on Governor Bill Lee's desk in Nashville, a governor who has shown a willingness to grant clemency in other contexts, who pardoned 23 individuals in December 2023 and 43 more in December 2024, but who has never intervened to stop a scheduled execution during his time in office. A virtual vigil has been organized for the morning of the scheduled execution, set for 9 a.m. Central Time at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee. And if nothing changes, if the federal court does not intervene, if Governor Bill Lee does not act, if the last remaining doors do not open, Tony Von Carruthers will become the first person in the United States in nearly 100 years to be executed after being forced to represent himself in an American court of law. 100 years, 5 unidentified fingerprints at a crime scene, unknown male DNA on a burial blanket, fingernail scrapings never fully analyzed, 3 additional untested biological items. A co-defendant who told investigators in 2011 that the convicted man was not there. A named alternative suspect whose DNA and fingerprints are on file and have never been compared to a single piece of evidence. A paid informant whose status was hidden for 30 years. A mentally ill man forced to defend himself alone in a capital murder trial, and an execution date marked on a calendar in Nashville. That is where this case stands right now. I have covered a great many cases on this channel. Cases where the evidence was complicated. Cases where reasonable people could look at the same facts and reach different conclusions. Cases where I genuinely was not sure what the truth was and told you so. This is not one of those cases. I am not saying with certainty that Tony Von Carruthers is innocent. I cannot say that. Only the evidence can say that. Only the DNA on that burial blanket. Only the fingerprints lifted from that crime scene. Only the tests that the state of Tennessee has refused to run for 15 years. What I am saying is this. The evidence to find out the truth exists. It is physical. It is preserved. It is testable. The biological profile of the man named as the actual perpetrator is sitting in a law enforcement database right now. There is no scientific obstacle to running this comparison. There is no logistical barrier. There is no reason, no legitimate, defensible, morally coherent reason why this test has not been run, except that someone decided not to run it. And the question that I cannot answer, the question that I do not believe the state of Tennessee can answer either, not honestly, not out loud, not in a way that survives scrutiny, is why. Why would you choose not to know? Why would a state that claims to be pursuing justice for Delois Anderson, for Marcellos Anderson, for Frederick Tucker, for a father in Memphis who has been waiting 30 years for this to be over, why would that state fight repeatedly in multiple courts across multiple years against running the one test that could confirm their certainty? If Tony Von Carruthers is guilty, the test will say so. Run it and close the case forever. Run it and give that father the unshakable, evidence-backed certainty that the right man paid for what was done to his family. Run it and silence every legal challenge, every advocacy organization, every person who has ever questioned this conviction permanently and completely. Unless the test might not say what the state of Tennessee needs it to say. Unless the certainty they have been performing for 30 years is not as solid as they have been claiming. Unless running that test, that one, single straightforward comparison, opens a door that 30 years of careful, deliberate institutional effort has been spent keeping closed. That is the question at the center of this case. Not whether 3 people were murdered in South Memphis in 1994. They were. Not whether their families deserve justice, they do, but whether the man scheduled to be executed at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee on the date that has been set, whether he is the right man. And the terrifying truth is that we do not know. We have never been allowed to know, because the state of Tennessee has spent 15 years making sure we never find out. Delois Anderson deserves the truth. Marcellos Anderson deserves the truth. Frederick Tucker deserves the truth. The father in Memphis who plans to stand in that room when the execution happens deserves the truth. And Tony Von Carruthers, whatever that truth turns out to be, deserves the truth too. The clock is running. The federal court is the last door. Governor Bill Lee's desk in Nashville is the last desk. And the DNA and the fingerprints and the burial blanket and the 5 unidentified prints from a crime scene in Memphis in 1994 are still sitting there, still waiting, still capable of answering the question that this entire case has refused to answer for 30 years. If this story reached something in you, if you watched from the cold open all the way to this moment and something in you shifted, do not let that feeling dissolve the moment this video ends. Share it right now, before you close this tab, before you scroll to the next thing, before the feeling fades. Share it with one person, because public pressure is the only language left that this situation can still respond to. Subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell, because when the next development in this case breaks, when the federal court rules, when the governor makes his decision, when May 21st arrives, you need to be there. And go to the comments. Tell me what you think should happen. Tell me whether you believe that tests should be run before this execution takes place. Tell me where in the world you are watching this from right now. Tell me what this case made you feel. Because the most dangerous thing in the world is not a broken system. The most dangerous thing in the world is a broken system surrounded by silent people. Do not be silent. The helicopter crashes. Not outside the compound. Inside it, 23 of the world's most elite soldiers are now on the ground inside enemy territory with a broken aircraft, no backup plan, and one target somewhere above them in the dark. They have 38 minutes before Pakistani military radar detects them. Floor 1 cleared. Floor 2 cleared. Then the third floor. 2 shots, and just like that, the most wanted man in human history was gone. No trial. No verdict. No last words. But here is the question no one has ever fully answered. Was this justice? Or did the most powerful government on earth decide they could not afford to let this man speak in a courtroom? Because what he knew, what he could have said under oath, might have shaken the foundations of everything you think you know about September 11. And the man who sat beside him and planned every single detail of that attack, in 2026 he is still alive, still waiting, and his trial has just collapsed again. Welcome to True Crime Corner. Today's case, the man they killed before he could talk. Before we get into it, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. We cover the cases governments wish you would forget every single week. And drop a comment below and tell us where in the world are you watching from. We want to hear from you. Now let's get into it. To understand why the world's most powerful military spent 10 years hunting one man burning through over $1 trillion, deploying hundreds of thousands of soldiers across 2 continents, and turning the entire architecture of global intelligence upside down, you first have to understand who that man really was. Not the myth, not the poster, not the grainy videotape that played on every news channel in the world. The man, his full name was Osama bin Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden. He was born on the 10th of March, 1957, in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, not in poverty, not in desperation, not in some forgotten corner of the world where violence feels like the only option. He was born into extraordinary wealth. His father, Mohammed bin Laden, was one of the richest construction magnates in the entire Middle East, a self-made billionaire whose company built mosques, palaces, and royal residences across Saudi Arabia. The bin Laden name was not associated with terror. It was associated with power, prestige, and proximity to the Saudi royal family. Osama was the 17th of 52 children, 52, born across multiple marriages, raised in a family empire so large it functioned more like a dynasty than a household. And yet, of all those children, it would be the 17th who would one day have his face on wanted posters in every country on earth. As a young man, Osama bin Laden enrolled at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, in the late 1970s, where he studied economics and business administration. He was not a struggling student. He was not a radical outsider. By every account of people who knew him then, he was quiet, devout, and deeply religious, a young man from a wealthy family who was beginning to ask very serious questions about the role of Islam in a changing world. And then came Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. For the Muslim world, this was not merely a political conflict. For many, it was a holy war, an assault by an atheist superpower on a Muslim nation. Young men from across the Arab world were called to fight, and Osama bin Laden answered that call not as a soldier, but as a financier and recruiter. He traveled to Peshawar, Pakistan, a dusty border city that had become the operational hub of the Afghan resistance, and began channeling his family's money into funding and arming Arab fighters against the Soviet military machine. He was in his mid-20s. He was a millionaire, and he was radicalizing fast. By the time the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan in humiliation in 1989, bin Laden had drawn a very specific and very dangerous conclusion from what he had witnessed, that a superpower could be brought to its knees by a determined, faith-driven fighting force. He had watched the mightiest military in the communist world collapse under guerrilla pressure, and he filed that lesson away. In 1988, while still based in Peshawar, Pakistan, bin Laden co-founded Al-Qaeda, which translates from Arabic as the base. He built it alongside 2 men whose names would become synonymous with global terrorism. Egyptian surgeon and ideologue Ayman al-Zawahiri and Palestinian scholar Abdullah Azzam, who would later be assassinated in a car bombing that many intelligence analysts attributed to internal al-Qaeda politics. From a network of offices, safe houses, and training camps strung across the Afghan-Pakistani border, bin Laden began constructing something the world had never seen before: a fully decentralized, self-financing, ideologically driven global terror organization. This was not a desperate man. This was a millionaire, educated, calculated, and patient, who spent years building a global terror network from an office in Pakistan, a man who understood finance, logistics, and human psychology, a man who could recruit a fighter in Cairo, fund his training in Kandahar, and deploy him to London, Nairobi, or New York without a single transaction traceable to him directly. And then on the 23rd of August, 1996, he made his intentions explicit to the entire world. From Khost province in eastern Afghanistan, bin Laden issued a formal fatwa, a religious decree that was, in plain language, a declaration of war against the United States of America, not against its military, not against its government, against its citizens, against its soldiers, against anyone, anywhere, who represented American power or American interests. The document called for the killing of American soldiers across the Middle East and openly declared that Muslim blood had been spilled by American hands for too long. Most Western governments dismissed it. Some analysts flagged it, and almost nobody took it as seriously as they should have. That was their first mistake. Here is what most documentaries leave out. Here is the chapter of this story that rarely makes it into the headlines, the textbooks, or the anniversary specials. Osama bin Laden was a wanted criminal long before the 11th of September, 2001. The United States government had him in their legal crosshairs 3 full years before those planes ever left the ground. There was an active warrant. There was a sitting indictment with his name at the top. And still they could not catch him. On the 8th of June, 1998, a United States federal grand jury secretly indicted Osama bin Laden under seal. The charges were filed at the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, one of the most powerful federal courtrooms in the country. The charge: conspiracy to attack defense utilities of the United States. It was sealed, meaning the public didn't know. The press didn't know. And bin Laden, sitting in Afghanistan, almost certainly had no idea that a New York grand jury had just put his name on a federal criminal complaint. That indictment was filed in June. By August, al-Qaeda had made any question of his guilt completely irrelevant. On the 7th of August, 1998, exactly 8 years to the day before the anniversary of American troops arriving in Saudi Arabia, a date bin Laden had publicly cited as a trigger for retaliation. Al-Qaeda operatives detonated truck bombs outside the United States Embassy in Nairobi, Kenya, and the United States Embassy in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, simultaneously, within minutes of each other, on 2 separate continents. 224 people were killed. Over 4,500 were injured. The majority of the dead were not Americans. They were Kenyan and Tanzanian civilians who happened to be near the buildings when the bombs went off. Office workers, street vendors, people waiting for visa appointments, people who had nothing to do with American foreign policy and everything to do with simply being in the wrong place on the wrong morning. The United States responded 13 days later. On the 20th of August, 1998, President Bill Clinton authorized Operation Infinite Reach, a retaliatory cruise missile strike targeting al-Qaeda training camps in Khost province, Afghanistan, and a pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum, Sudan, which the CIA believed was being used to produce chemical weapons precursors. 75 Tomahawk cruise missiles were fired from U.S. Navy ships in the Arabian Sea and Red Sea. The missiles struck, buildings were destroyed, training camps were leveled, but Osama bin Laden was not there. According to multiple intelligence reports declassified in subsequent years, bin Laden had left the targeted camp in Khost just a few hours before the missiles hit. A few hours. Whether that was coincidence, a tip-off, or simply luck remains one of the enduring mysteries of this entire case. Either way, he walked away from a 75 missile strike without a scratch. And the message that sent both to his followers and to himself was profound. America had fired its most powerful conventional weapons at him, and he had survived. 2 months later, on the 4th of November, 1999, 998. The U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York issued a second, far more expansive indictment. This time, the charges were no longer sealed. This time, they were explicit. Osama bin Laden was formally charged with conspiracy to murder United States nationals anywhere in the world. The evidence cited in the indictment included testimony from former al-Qaeda members who had defected and were cooperating with federal investigators, as well as intercepted satellite phone communications that placed bin Laden at the center of the network responsible for the embassy bombings. The warrant was issued. The bounty was set, eventually reaching $25 million, one of the largest rewards in American law enforcement history. Wanted posters with his face were distributed across 30 countries. Interpol was notified. Every allied intelligence agency from London to Islamabad was briefed, and Osama bin Laden released a videotape from somewhere in Afghanistan, sitting calmly in robes, praising the embassy bombings, and laughing at the United States government. The indictment was open. The warrant was active. The money was on the table, and the most wanted man on earth was sitting in front of a camera, somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, untouchable, unbothered, and already planning something that would make the embassy bombings look like a rehearsal. On the morning of the 11th of September, 2001, 19 al-Qaeda operatives boarded 4 commercial aircraft at airports in Boston, Washington, D.C., and Newark, New Jersey. They had trained for this. They had lived inside the United States for months. They had taken flight lessons, conducted surveillance, and communicated in coded messages that American intelligence had intercepted fragments of, but never fully decoded in time. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan, New York City. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 struck the western facade of the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. At 10:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93, its passengers, having learned of the other attacks and mounted a resistance against the hijackers, crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Its intended target, believed to be either the United States Capitol or the White House, never reached. By 10:28 a.m., when the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed into the streets of Manhattan, 2,977 people were dead. Men, women, and children from 93 different countries, firefighters who had run into burning buildings, office workers who had simply shown up for another Tuesday morning, people who had called their families from phones on hijacked planes to say goodbye. 2,977 people, gone. In under 2 hours, the indictment filed in New York 3 years earlier suddenly felt like a footnote. The United States did not want Osama bin Laden in a courtroom anymore. They wanted something else entirely. On the 7th of October, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom, a full-scale military invasion of Afghanistan. The stated objectives were clear: dismantle al-Qaeda's operational infrastructure, topple the Taliban government that had provided bin Laden and his network with a safe haven, and capture or kill Osama bin Laden himself. 40 countries eventually contributed forces to the coalition. It was the beginning of what would become the longest war in American history. Bin Laden did not wait for the invasion to reach him. He moved. By December 2001, American and coalition forces had cornered what they believed to be a significant portion of al-Qaeda's leadership, including bin Laden himself, in the Tora Bora mountain range in Nangarhar province in eastern Afghanistan. Tora Bora was a vast, ancient network of caves and tunnels cut into some of the most brutal terrain on Earth. It was, in many ways, the perfect fortress. The Battle of Tora Bora lasted from the 12th to the 17th of December, 2001. American bombers dropped thousands of pounds of ordnance onto the mountainside. Afghan militia forces swept through the caves on the ground, and somewhere in the chaos, in the darkness, and through the mountain passes that crossed into Pakistan's tribal regions, Osama bin Laden slipped away. Again, the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee would later publish a detailed report concluding that the failure to capture bin Laden at Tora Bora was the single greatest strategic failure of the entire war on terror. The decision not to deploy American ground troops directly to rely instead on local Afghan militia, who may have been bribed to look the other way, allowed the most wanted man in the world to walk out of Afghanistan on foot and disappear into Pakistan. And disappear he did, completely. For the next 9 years, from 2002 all the way through to 2011, Osama bin Laden lived not in a cave, not in a remote mountain hideout, not in some primitive wilderness. He lived in a house, a large, custom-built compound in a suburban neighborhood called Bilal Town, in the city of Abbottabad, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, Pakistan. Local residents had given the compound a nickname, Waziristan Haveli, a name that implied it belonged to someone from the tribal regions, someone wealthy and private, someone you did not ask questions about. The compound itself was an architectural statement of paranoia and calculation. Its walls were made of solid concrete, standing 18 feet high, and topped with additional layers of barbed wire. There were 2 heavy security gates, one leading to the main residence, one to the guest house. There was no internet connection of any kind. There was no landline telephone. Mobile phones were forbidden inside the walls. The residents burned every piece of their own garbage, rather than putting it out for collection, because bin Laden knew that even a discarded envelope, a food wrapper, or a medicine bottle could give him away. He had been living there for nearly a decade, in a suburban house, in a city with a population of over 500,000 people. And here is the detail that, even now, is difficult to fully absorb. The compound at Bilal Town, in Abbottabad, sat just 1,300 meters, barely a 15-minute walk from the main gate of the Pakistan Military Academy, the institution that trains every officer in the Pakistani Army, the Pakistani equivalent of West Point, or Sandhurst, or Duntroon, the most militarily saturated address in the entire country. Whether the Pakistani government and military knew bin Laden was there and chose to say nothing, or whether the world's most wanted man genuinely lived for 9 years within walking distance of Pakistan's most prestigious military institution, without a single person reporting it, remains one of the most contested and uncomfortable questions in modern geopolitical history. Pakistan has always denied knowledge. Very few people in the intelligence community believe them. The break in the case did not come from satellites, or from intelligence sharing, or from a defector walking into a U.S. embassy. It came from a phone call, a CIA surveillance team, operating as part of a years-long effort to trace bin Laden's inner circle, had identified a man known as Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, a trusted personal courier who had worked directly for bin Laden for years. Bin Laden, who trusted almost no one and communicated with almost no electronic device, used human couriers to carry physical messages between himself and al-Qaeda's operational leadership. Al-Kuwaiti was one of the most trusted of those couriers. In 2010, al-Kuwaiti made a phone call. The CIA intercepted it, traced it, and followed it directly to a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, at the precise GPS coordinates of 34 degrees, 10 minutes, 9 seconds north, and 73 degrees, 14 minutes, 33 seconds east. The CIA set up a safe house nearby. They watched the compound for months. They observed the patterns of movement, the number of residents, the physical dimensions of the buildings. They noted that one man tall, with a long beard, walked in circles inside the compound walls every single day, never leaving, never looking up, never approaching the gate. They called him the Pacer. They could not confirm his identity, but they were almost certain. Almost. If you are new to this channel, now is the time. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. We cover the cases governments try to erase every single week. Every single week. For months, the CIA watched that compound in Abbottabad. Satellites overhead, ground agents in the surrounding streets. Intercepted communications analyzed and reanalyzed. They were almost certain the Pacer was Osama bin Laden. Almost. Because what happened next, the decision that was made in the most powerful office in the world, was not simply a military operation. It was a choice that could have triggered a war between 2 nuclear-armed nations. It was a decision that, if it went wrong, would have ended careers, shattered alliances, and potentially sparked an international crisis unlike anything the world had seen since the Cold War. And it had to be made by one man, sitting in Washington, D.C., 3,800 miles away from Abbottabad. There is a particular kind of silence that fills a room when the most powerful man in the world is about to make a decision that cannot be undone. By the spring of 2011, President Barack Obama had been sitting with this intelligence for months. The CIA had brought him the Abbottabad file. They had shown him the satellite photographs, the surveillance logs, the movement patterns of the tall, bearded man who walked in circles inside that walled compound every single day and never once stepped outside its gates. They had walked him through the intercepts, the courier trail, the years of painstaking intelligence work that had led, thread by thread, to a single address in a suburban Pakistani city. And they had told him, with all the certainty they could professionally offer, that there was perhaps a 60 to 80% probability that the man living inside that compound was Osama bin Laden. 60 to 80%. Not certainty. Probability. Obama gathered his National Security Council at the White House in Washington, D.C. throughout March and April of 2011 for a series of top-secret briefings. The meetings were held in secured conference rooms, attended only by the most senior figures in American national security. Vice President Joe Biden was there. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was there. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates was there. CIA Director Leon Panetta was there. And each of them had an opinion about what should happen next. 3 options were placed on the table. The first was a B-2 stealth bomber strike. Drop enough precision ordnance on the compound to destroy everything inside it, leave nothing standing, and eliminate the target with zero risk to American personnel. It was the cleanest option from a military standpoint, but it came with a devastating flaw. If the compound was destroyed from the air, there would be no way to confirm whether the man inside had actually been bin Laden. No body, no DNA, no proof. After 10 years of searching, the United States could spend another decade arguing with the world about whether they had actually killed him. The second option was a drone strike, more precise than a bomber, smaller footprint, deniable. But it carried the exact same evidentiary problem. And a drone strike on Pakistani soil, in a city with an active military presence, was an act that could not easily be explained away. The third option was the most dangerous. Send in soldiers. Put American boots on the ground inside the sovereign territory of a nuclear-armed allied nation without telling that nation, without asking permission, and without any guarantee that the Pakistani military would not scramble jets and intercept the helicopters before they ever reached the compound. If that happened, American soldiers would find themselves in direct armed conflict with the military of a country that was officially a partner in the war on terror. The diplomatic consequences would have been catastrophic. The human consequences could have been worse. Obama chose the third option. He authorized the ground raid in late April 2011. The mission was assigned to the Naval Special Warfare Development Group known publicly as SEAL Team 6, the most elite special operations unit in the United States military. Men who had trained for exactly this kind of scenario for their entire careers. Men who had conducted hundreds of similar raids across Afghanistan and Iraq, in darkness, in silence, under fire. The original launch date was the 30th of April, 2011. The helicopters were prepped, the team was briefed, and then, at the last moment, the mission was called off. Heavy cloud cover over Abbottabad made the visual insertion too risky. They would wait one more day. On the night of the 1st of May, 2011, the weather cleared. The mission code name was Operation Neptune Spear. The personal identifier code word assigned to the target, the word that would be spoken over the radio when and if Osama bin Laden was confirmed, was a single name. Geronimo. 23 operators from SEAL Team 6 boarded 2 modified stealth Black Hawk helicopters at Jalalabad Airfield in Nangarhar Province, Afghanistan. These were not standard Black Hawks. They had been specially modified to reduce their radar cross-section and suppress their acoustic signature, making them significantly harder to detect on radar and quieter in the air than conventional military aircraft. 2 larger Chinook helicopters were held in reserve at Jalalabad, carrying backup forces and medical teams, ready to enter Pakistani airspace if the mission went wrong. The helicopters crossed the Pakistani border in complete radio silence, flying low and fast through the darkness. They had not notified Pakistani authorities. They had not filed a flight plan. They had not informed a single official in Islamabad that American Special Forces were currently flying through Pakistani airspace toward a city that sat next to Pakistan's premier military institution. This was not an oversight. It was deliberate. The intelligence community had deep concerns about potential leaks within Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, the ISI. If the wrong person in Islamabad had received a phone call that night, bin Laden could have vanished before the helicopters ever crossed the border. So they told nobody, and they flew. At approximately 1 o'clock in the morning on the 2nd of May, 2011, the two Black Hawk helicopters descended toward the Waziristan Haveli compound in Bilal town, Abbottabad. The streets below were dark and quiet. The city was asleep. The 18-foot walls of the compound rose up in the green-tinted glow of the SEALs' night vision equipment. And then, the first helicopter stalled. As the lead Black Hawk moved into a low hover over the compound to allow the SEALs to fast rope down into the courtyard, it lost lift. The combination of higher-than-expected air temperature, the high altitude of Abbottabad, and the turbulence generated by the compound's own 18-foot walls created a phenomenon known as a vortex ring, state a catastrophic loss of rotor effectiveness. The helicopter dropped hard. Its tail caught on the top of the compound wall, and the aircraft came down inside the courtyard in a controlled crash. Its nose buried in the dirt, its tail section destroyed. 23 of the world's most elite soldiers had just had their primary aircraft destroyed on the ground, inside a hostile compound, in the middle of a city in a foreign country that had no idea they were there. Most operations would have ended right there. This one did not pause for a single second. The SEALs on the downed helicopter exited immediately and continued the mission on foot. The second helicopter, seeing what had happened, adapted its landing approach and put down outside the compound walls. Those operators breached the perimeter using controlled explosive charges, blowing through a section of the outer wall and entering the compound grounds. The assault moved from the outside in and from the ground up. On the ground floor of the guest house, the SEALs encountered bin Laden's most trusted courier, the man whose phone call had led them to this exact address, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, whose real name was Ibrahim Saeed Ahmed. He was armed. He was shot and killed. His wife was also wounded in the exchange of fire. The team moved to the main residential building. The ground floor was cleared. They moved to the second floor. More resistance. More rooms swept in darkness, in silence, with a precision that comes only from thousands of hours of training and hundreds of real operations. Then the stairs to the third floor. At approximately 1:40 in the morning, roughly 40 minutes after the helicopters had first crossed into Pakistani airspace, two members of SEAL Team 6 reached the top of the staircase on the third floor of the main building of the Waziristan Haveli compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Osama bin Laden was standing there. He was not in a cave. He was not in a bunker. He was in a bedroom. He was tall, 6 feet 4 inches, and gaunt, and he was not armed with a weapon in his hands when the SEALs came through that door. He was shot once in the chest and once above his left eye. Osama bin Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, born the 17th child of a Saudi construction billionaire, educated at a university in Jeddah, radicalized in the mountains of Afghanistan, the founder of Al-Qaeda, the architect of the deadliest terror attack in American history, died on the third floor of a house in a Pakistani suburb at approximately 1:40 in the morning on the 2nd of May. Liantianling Ishiyi. He was 54 years old. Also killed in the raid that night were his adult son, Khalid bin Laden, the courier, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, and at least one other compound resident. One woman was wounded in crossfire. The entire operation from the moment the first helicopter crossed the compound wall to the moment the last SEAL exited lasted approximately 38 to 40 minutes. 3,800 miles away, in the Situation Room of the White House in Washington, D.C., President Barack Obama sat at a conference table surrounded by the most senior figures in American national security. They had been watching the raid unfold in real time, through a live video feed transmitted from a surveillance drone circling above the compound, and from cameras carried by some of the operators on the ground. Nobody in that room spoke above a whisper for the entire 40 minutes. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton later described the tension in that room as unlike anything she had ever experienced in her decades of public service. A photograph taken by White House photographer Pete Souza during those 40 minutes, showing Obama leaning forward in his chair, hands clasped, watching a screen just off camera, surrounded by grim-faced officials, became one of the most iconic images of the entire post-September 11 era. Then, over the Secure Communications channel, came 3 words from CIA Director Leon Panetta In the operations center, Geronimo. IKEA. Enemy killed in action. The room exhaled. Obama had authorized a raid that could have triggered a war between two nuclear nations. He had sent 23 men into a foreign country without permission. He had gambled the credibility of his entire presidency on a 60 to 80% probability, and it had worked. At 12:16 in the morning Eastern Time on the 2nd of May, 2011, President Obama addressed the nation from the East Room of the White House. His words were measured, deliberate, and historic. Justice had been done. But had it? Within hours of the announcement, the questions began, and they have never fully stopped. The first question was the most immediate. Osama bin Laden was unarmed when he was shot. United States officials confirmed this within 48 hours of the raid. There was no gun in his hand. There was no weapon within reach. He was standing in a bedroom on the 3rd floor of a house, and he was shot twice, once in the chest, once above the left eye, and he was unarmed. Under American domestic law, an unarmed man can still be considered a threat. Under the rules of engagement applied to enemy combatants in a declared conflict zone, the legal picture is more complex. But under international human rights law, the body of law that governs how states are permitted to treat individuals, even individuals accused of the gravest crimes. The killing of an unarmed man who had not formally surrendered opened the United States to serious legal scrutiny. Amnesty International was among the first organizations to call for a full independent investigation into the circumstances of the killing. International legal scholars published analyses in journals and newspapers around the world, arguing that bin Laden, who was not a uniformed soldier, who had been formally indicted in a civilian federal court, and who was unarmed at the moment of his death, may have had the right under international law to be arrested, taken into custody, and tried before a court of law. The United States government's position was clear and consistent. Bin Laden was the operational leader of an organization that had declared war on the United States, planned the deaths of nearly 3,000 Americans, and remained an active and ongoing threat to American lives. Under the laws of armed conflict, he was a legitimate military target. He had not surrendered, and given the operational circumstances of a 40-minute raid in a foreign country with hostile military forces potentially minutes away, capturing him alive was not a realistic objective. Others disagreed. They argued that the decision to kill rather than capture had less to do with operational necessity and more to do with political inconvenience, that a living Osama bin Laden, sitting in a courtroom in New York, would have been given a platform, that he would have spoken, that whatever he said under oath, whatever he knew about the relationships between al-Qaeda and various governments and intelligence services around the world, could have been deeply uncomfortable for a very long list of powerful people. There is no definitive answer to that question. There is only the question itself. After DNA testing confirmed bin Laden's identity to a 99.9% certainty, his body was transported aboard a U.S. military aircraft to the USS Carl Vinson, an aircraft carrier stationed in the North Arabian Sea. In accordance with Islamic tradition requiring burial within 24 hours of death, and in the absence of any Muslim nation willing to accept his remains for interment on land, his body was washed, wrapped in a white sheet, placed in a weighted bag, and dropped into the sea. No grave, no marker, no physical location where followers or enemies could gather. He was gone in every sense of the word. In February of 2012, Pakistani authorities demolished the Waziristan Haveli compound in Abbottabad. The 18-foot walls, the security gates, the building where bin Laden had hidden for 9 years, all of it was razed to the ground. Today, the site is an empty lot. There is nothing left. Pakistan maintained, as it has always maintained, that it had no knowledge bin Laden was living within its borders, that no officer, no official, no intelligence operative in the entire country had any idea that the world's most wanted man had been building a life in a walled compound, barely a walking distance from the gates of the nation's most prestigious military academy. Very few people in the global intelligence community have ever believed that claim. Osama bin Laden never sat on death row. He never stood before a judge. He never heard the word guilty spoken in a courtroom. The indictment filed at the Southern District of New York in November of 1998 with his full name typed at the top was simply closed. No verdict, no sentence, no legal conclusion of any kind. Whether that was justice or whether it was something else entirely is a question this case will never fully answer. But here is what will truly keep you up at night. There is another man. A man who did not escape to Pakistan. A man who was captured. A man who has been in American custody for over 20 years. A man who, by his own public admission, sat across a table from Osama bin Laden and designed, planned, and coordinated the September 11 attacks in precise, operational detail. His name is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He was born on the 14th of April, 1964, in Kuwait. And as of right now, in 2026, he has not been convicted of a single crime. He was captured on the 1st of March, 2003, in Rawalpindi, Pakistan, by a joint operation between the CIA and Pakistani intelligence. He was transferred to Guantanamo Bay Detention Facility in Cuba in September of 2006. Pre-trial hearings in his military commission case began on the 5th of May, 2012. That was 14 years ago. In August of 2024, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed agreed to a plea deal. He would plead guilty to planning the September 11 attacks in exchange for a sentence of life imprisonment rather than death. The families of the nearly 3,000 people killed on September 11 were notified. The courtroom at the Expeditionary Legal Complex at Guantanamo Bay was prepared. It appeared, after over 2 decades, that some form of legal resolution was finally within reach. And then, within days, a panel of 3 federal appeals court judges suspended the deal. They ruled that it could not proceed, that it would cause irreparable damage, that it needed further review. In January of 2025, a military judge suspended proceedings again just days before Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was due to walk into court and formally enter his guilty plea in open court. One of his co-defendants, Ramzi bin al-Shibh, one of the key operational coordinators of the September 11 attacks, was ruled mentally unfit to stand trial in 2023, fracturing the case even further. Prosecutors now estimate that jury selection could begin in January of 2027. If that timeline holds, it will be 26 years after the attacks before this case reaches a jury. 26 years. Attorneys for the defendants have a name for it. They call it the forever trial. The man who planned the deaths of 2,977 people is sitting in a cell in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, right now, today, in 2026. Without a verdict, without a sentence, waiting. Osama bin Laden was killed in 40 minutes. The man he tasked with carrying out his most devastating attack has been waiting for justice for over 2 decades, and the end is still not in sight. That full story, the torture, the plea deals, the collapsed trials, the 6 judges, the 26 years, and the question of whether justice in this case is even still possible, is coming in the next video on this channel. Make sure you are subscribed. Make sure that notification bell is on, because that story is one of the most extraordinary legal and moral failures in the history of modern justice, and you do not want to miss it. And before you go, drop a comment below. Just one question. Do you believe Khalid Sheikh Mohammed deserves the death penalty? Or did what the CIA did to him in those black sites, the waterboarding, the sleep deprivation, the interrogation techniques that courts have since ruled unlawful, make a fair trial impossible from the very beginning? Tell us what you think. We read every single comment. And tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. We will see you in the next one.